Back in March of this year, I released my third video on YouTube, a review of Helldivers 2. Not only did it become my first video to reach 100 views, but it also gained real traction, eventually surpassing 1,000 views. Now, 6 months later, the game that many deemed as the Helldivers 2 killer is finally here. Granted, Sony sealed the fate of that game a long time ago.
We had a good thing, you stupid son of a bitch. You could have shut your mouth, cooked, and made as much money as you ever needed. It was perfect. But no, you just had to blow it up. You and your pride and your ego. You just had to be the man.
Following the PlayStation Network controversy, gamers from around the world have been eagerly awaiting the release of the newest entry in the Warhammer universe, Space Marine 2. It's arguably been the most highly anticipated game of the year, but regardless of where you stand, there's no denying that Space Marine 2 has made a significant impact on the industry, becoming both a critical and financial success for Saber Interactive. This video is dedicated to those who have seen the hype surrounding the game, but like myself hadn't been exposed to the Warhammer 40k universe until this game released. To keep it short and sweet, yes, Space Marine 2 does live up to the hype, but I can't confidently recommend it to everybody. The game does have a few flaws, and over the course of this review I'll be breaking down both the main campaign and the online game modes, all while diving into the game's visuals, story, and gameplay. Before diving into the main campaign of Space Marine 2, it only makes sense to first introduce the Warhammer 40k universe and the original Space Marine game from 2011. I want to reiterate that Space Marine 2 is my first and only experience with the Warhammer universe, so I'll keep this introduction brief and basic. To any diehard Warhammer fans out there, I'm sure I'll get some details wrong, so feel free to correct me down in the comments. Warhammer 40k is a science fiction universe with fantasy elements, set in the 41st millennium, an era where humanity has conquered the stars. The human race has expanded into the Imperium of Man, a vast empire constantly at war with alien races and the dark forces of chaos. From what I understand, Chaos is essentially a collection of demons from alternate dimensions with 4 different factions. What makes Warhammer stand out from other science fiction universes is the distinctly grim and dystopian future. I wouldn't want to be alive in the Warhammer universe, as humanity has devolved into a brutal dictatorship. And when I say there's no peace, I mean never. Humanity is locked in an eternal war, fighting off alien threats and dealing with demon armies that appear because society has way too much sex. Yes, that's canon.
You need to leave!
Warhammer is known for its recognizable grimdark style, where oppressive and gritty themes are contrasted with gothic influences. Many of the buildings and ships resemble massive cathedrals, adorned with detailed carvings, towering spires, and huge arches. When not drawing from religious or ancient architecture, the environments often incorporate heavy industrial elements, emphasizing the cold, war-torn nature of the universe. Together, these artistic and thematic elements create what many describe as the Middle Ages in space. If you're interested in exploring more of the lore, I'll have several good videos linked in the description that do a great job of explaining the universe. But that brings us to the first Space Marine game that was released in 2011. What's important to know is that Space Marine is an incredibly well-made third-person shooter that many mistakenly label as a Gears of War clone. The funny thing is, Warhammer had a 20-year head start, originating as a tabletop RPG back in the late 1980s. Now while the two franchises have a lot of thematic similarities, they both play pretty different from one another. Yes, both are third-person shooters where you play as bulky armored heroes that carry chainsaw weapons. However, Gears of War is a slow, cover-based shooter, while Space Marine has a huge emphasis on fast-paced melee combat with no cover or crouching mechanics. In Gears of War, you're just a soldier who's another cog in the machine, but in Space Marine, well, you play as a Space Marine.
Yeah, no shit, Sherlock!
These guys are basically the special forces of the human empire. Think of them as the Spartans from Halo, except Space Marines are genetically modified humans who on average are 8 feet tall with 2 hearts and 3 lungs. To call them super soldiers would be an understatement. They're more like miniature Hulks that are encased in the power armor from the Fallout series. With all that being said, you don't need any prior experience with the Warhammer universe or the first Space Marine game to enjoy Space Marine 2. The game stands on its own, allowing you to jump in, follow the narrative, and have a blast whether you're a Warhammer veteran or a complete beginner like I was. In the main campaign, you'll once again play as Captain Titus, the protagonist of the first game. Space Marine 2 takes place about 200 years after the original, with the main threat shifting from the human-speaking orcs to hordes of hive-minded aliens. The main enemy throughout the game is the Tyranids, who are stereotypical bug-looking aliens that will be instantly recognizable to fans of Starship Troopers or anyone who has played Helldivers 2. In Space Marine 2, players will face endless hordes of Tyranids, and it looks incredibly impressive. In the final minutes of the opening mission, the game throws a massive horde at you, which seems like a balancing issue since it's arguably the largest and longest lasting swarm in the entire game. To make things even more intense, you'll have to tackle this horde alone without your squad mates. Maybe I just struggled because I wasn't used to the controls, or maybe this challenge was intentional. After completing the opening mission, Captain Titus is introduced to Sergeant Gadrick and Brother Chiron, who will serve as your squad mates throughout the main campaign. They'll fight alongside you for the rest of the story, and if you have some friends, they can jump into the game as one or both of them. Yes, you heard that right, a 2024 AAA game offers co-op in its single-player campaign.
Wow.
The main campaign isn't going to win any Game of the Year awards for its narrative, but the story is perfectly serviceable to the gameplay that's offered. Captain Titus and his squad undertake a variety of military operations across 3 different planets, with mission structures that are fairly straightforward, ranging from defending objectives and attacking enemy positions to collecting data and rescuing people in need. The missions themselves don't offer much in terms of story, but the dynamic between Titus and his squad mates is a constant throughout the game, providing moments of compelling drama. The first few hours of Space Marine 2 will take place on a jungle world called Kadaku, which for all intents and purposes is just space Vietnam, but the majority of the game will take place on a colonized human world called Avarax. On both worlds, you'll be taking on Tyranids, and the gameplay that follows is pretty basic. The third-person shooting feels pretty generic in the nicest way possible, but the biggest surprise for me was how engaging the melee combat was. Not to have a Skyrim with guns moment, but Space Marine 2 feels a lot like God of War with guns. You only have one attack button, which is the right bumper, but you can chain together multiple combos by tapping for a basic swing or holding for a power attack. When facing hordes of Tyranids, you need to be on the lookout for attacks that you can counter and ones that you can't. A blue indicator shows a counter opportunity, while a red indicator warns you to dodge and avoid damage. Unlike God of War, where you throw an axe for long-range attacks, Space Marine offers several different firearms. You can carry one primary weapon out of 11 options, one secondary gun out of 3, and one melee weapon out of 4. Additionally, you can equip one type of explosive, choosing between frag grenades, sticky grenades, or landmines. For certain operations, you'll get access to 2 special weapons, one being a flamethrower that you'll end up using to ward off swarms of rats in a certain mission, as well as a powerful minigun that feels incredibly satisfying to use. Finally, Titus can use a special ability called Righteous Fury, which for a short period of time will boost weapon damage and constantly refill your health. The campaign only offers one other special ability on occasion, a jetpack that can be used to reach high places or launch devastating attacks. The game gives you plenty of combat options, but unfortunately, if you're playing by yourself, there isn't a lot of room for experimentation. Space Marine 2 is a whole lot of fun for the first few hours, but eventually the gameplay will start to feel a little bit repetitive. It also doesn't help that towards the end of the game, you're introduced to the Heretics, which are human soldiers and Space Marines that have been possessed by the forces of chaos. Once you start fighting these guys, the game feels more like a generic third-person shooter. This isn't a huge criticism, but ultimately the locations you visit and the moments you experience keep the game feeling fresh, thanks to the amazing visuals. I think Space Marine 2 has taken the crown for the best looking game of all time. It doesn't have the industry's best lighting or textures, but the backdrops that some of these levels have are literally jaw-dropping. The game is filled with plenty of moments that make you go wow, as you look upon thousands of stampeding aliens in the distance, or take in a monolithic Gothic structure. The level of detail in the world design is astounding, and Saber Interactive deserves all the praise in the world. Space Marine 2 actually has something in common with one of my favorite games ever, Grand Theft Auto 4. In both games, whenever you look up, the field of view gets bigger to encompass more of the image. You can see that it's much more pronounced in GTA 4, but it's still something that I noticed in Space Marines 2, and it does add to the wow factor of the visuals. And that's most of what the campaign has to offer without doing too much of a deep dive. There's been some negative comments thrown at the game, mainly criticizing the game's length for being too short. I've heard that some people have been able to beat the game in 7 to 8 hours, but for me, the main campaign took about 10 to 12 hours, which in my opinion is plenty of time for a single player story. I will say I wish there was more options for people who only want to play a single player experience. The main campaign is just one of 3 main game modes, the other 2 being online only. There's a game mode called Operations, which is an online co-op mode. It serves as an extension of the main campaign as you play in missions that occurred off-screen while you were playing as Captain Titus. What separates it from the main campaign and warrants a whole other game mode is that you have to play with other real-life players. If you're a bit antisocial like myself, you can still play Operations without engaging with other people, but you'll never know if you'll get paired with somebody who keeps trying to talk to you. In the Operations game mode, you can select one of 6 classes to play as. Each class has a small selection of weapons and abilities that makes each one feel different, like the Heavy, which carries a minigun and has a shield for a special ability, or the Vanguard, which carries automatic weapons and has a grapple launcher. Unlike the main campaign that only offers 2 special abilities, the online game mode gives you 6, from shields to grapple hooks and even an invisibility cloak. You can also customize the way each class looks, with different helmets, armor plates, and colors that you can unlock just by playing the game. The third and final game mode is PvP, and it feels like a return to the PS3 and Xbox 360 era of standard third-person multiplayer game modes. It's basic but fun online multiplayer that I'm sure plenty of people will have fun investing several hours into. The PvP game mode borrows the same 6 classes and customization from the Operations game mode, so it's safe to say that if you thought the main campaign lacked content, then you'll probably find more of what you were looking for in the online game modes. Ahead of its release, Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 had Game of the Year expectations, and although I don't think this game will end up winning Game of the Year, I do think it reached, and in some instances exceeded expectations. The main campaign features a lot of stupid fun, with arguably the biggest leap in visuals since a game like The Last of Us Part 2 or Red Dead Redemption 2. While the third-person action is pretty standard compared to the rest of the industry, I was surprised and happy with the hack-and-slash gameplay. The game doesn't have many negatives, although I did experience a persistent audio glitch throughout the entire game. For the entire game, the audio had almost no issues, however when I died and respawned, the voice audio would glitch out for the first few minutes, so after I respawned from dying, I wouldn't be able to hear anything the characters were supposed to be saying.
Stand aside.
Besides that, there's nothing overwhelmingly negative I can say about the game. The multiplayer game modes are really fun, but personally they're not for me. If you're someone who strictly plays single player games, then I would maybe recommend you wait until this game goes on sale. Yes, the game is around $60 and we should give Saber Interactive some praise for not raising their prices like other companies. However, we have experienced crazy levels of inflation over the past few years, and $60 is not what it once was. While the prices of certain games like Space Marine 2 haven't gone up, the prices on everything else in our economy have, like fast food prices that have literally doubled compared to their pre-COVID prices. If the $60 price tag doesn't bother you, then I absolutely recommend this game. But if you value your money and want to get the best bang for your buck, maybe wait for the game to go on sale. Overall for me, Space Marine 2 has been my favorite game of the year so far, and if you have some friends that will play the game with you, this could easily be a game of the year for you. If you stayed this far and enjoyed, please like the video, consider subscribing, and leave me your thoughts in the comments. There's a good chance that some of you are returning from my previous 2 videos, and if you've been a loyal viewer up to this point, thank you so much for your support. For my next video, I'm going to return to a game that I haven't played in 11 years, so make sure to turn on notifications to never miss out on one of my new uploads.